I'm really happy that we have Dr. Scott McDonald from Hohenheim University with us today. He flew all the way from England to give this lecture. I've had a chance to speak with him on a couple of occasions. It's fantastic to have this job and listen and get to know people who know so much about regions such as Africa. Let me do a short intro and then we'll open it up for his lecture. Professor Scott McDonald has been involved in projects in 4 areas. And forgive me, I am not an economist, so if I butcher this. Computable general equilibrium modeling, international trade and development, social accounting matrices, and climate change. His research has resulted in the development of a series of single country and CGE models, which have been used inter alia in research with Joint Research Center of the European Union, the government of Egypt and South Africa, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and resources for the future. With respect to international trade and development, Professor McDonald's research has explored the impacts of change in trade and development policies, with particular emphasis on the income distribution and poverty implications of different trade and development policies in southern South Africa, Botswana, Ethiopia, and India. Other projects have concentrated on the development of data collation and estimation for SAM and the impact of climate change on economic well-being, such as carbon trading and mitigation strategies. Scott has undergone consultancy for and research with a number of institutions and government departments, including the World Bank, Joint Research Center of the European Union, Resources for the Future, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and South African Department of Agriculture. Let's please give Dr. McDonald a warm Naval Academy welcome.
2 things we start with. I'm not sure I recognize myself in that introduction, but never mind. Second one is that while notionally we speak the same language, we don't. So if I start saying things and using colloquialisms and things that have no meaning at all to you, you probably best interrupt me. And I suppose the third thing is that if there's things whilst I'm speaking you want points of clarification, fine. If it's a question or something will take longer, I'll be quite blunt and tell you I'll carry on and do that at the end, okay? What I've been asked to speak about is the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. Just to give you some perspective on this, there is no 2 dams in America as big as this, combined. It will be the biggest dam ever built in Africa, and it's close to the biggest dam ever built. It's all being funded out of the Ethiopian government's money, and it is a monster. I'm hoping this machine is going to work as it's supposed to, and if it doesn't, I'm going to have to wander around. Okay, just to give you some perspective of where we're talking about on this. Okay, there is enormous hydro potential in Ethiopia. Most people would, most of you will look at Ethiopia now and think it's a dry country and what have you. It isn't. Unfortunately, at the moment it is, so whilst you're eating your Papa John, remember they've got a famine on there at the moment. And it's a serious one. However, 80% approximately of the waters of the Nile River fall in Ethiopia. Across the country of Ethiopia, the average rainfall is between 3/4 and a meter a year. A meter is 39 inches. So you've got enormous potential here. The Grand Ethiopian is on the Abe River, euphemistically referred to as the Blue Nile. It's about 40 kilometers from the Sudanese border. At the moment, Ethiopia generates very little electricity itself, but it's got big capacity. The GERD will be the biggest hydroelectric power project in Africa at 6,000 megawatts and an annual 15,000 gigawatts. That is big. Its cost is approximately $4.8 billion, around 15% of Ethiopia's GDP, and it's self-financed. There's a reason why it's self-financed, and that's one of the things we'll look at as we go through. I really wish this machine would work, but never mind. Okay, just to give you some sort of geographic perspective on Ethiopia, This is essentially the Rift Valley. Most of you will have seen pictures of the Grand Canyon. The Grand Canyon's a bit small. The Rift Valley is an awful sight bigger. What you've got is you've got a watershed going that way and that way. These rivers flow out through Djibouti, through Somalia, and through into Kenya. There are big hydro plants on there. The Nile waters all flow north and west from the Rift Valley. You've got the Tekese River here that flows up and becomes the Abatay River in Ethiopia, in Sudan, and joins the White Nile a long way north of Khartoum. It provides about 12% of the water that reaches the Aswan High Dam in Egypt. You've got another river down here, a river system called the Baro Akbo, that flows out into Sudan and joins the White Nile way south of Khartoum. It also provides about 12% of the water that reaches the Aswan High Dam. The Blue Nile, or the Abe River, starts in the Ethiopian Highlands near the Simien Mountains here. There's a watershed here. Flows south and east and then loops around and comes out into Sudan, forms what's known as the Blue Nile, and the Blue Nile and the White Nile merge just north of Khartoum. This provides approximately 60% of the water that reaches the Aswan High Dam. In Spate during the rainy season, the waters flowing out of the Blue Nile are so big that they block up and back up the White Nile. It actually stops the White Nile's flow. Okay, give you some sort of idea if this is Ethiopian highland area. The people in Ethiopia live in the highlands. They live in the highlands despite the fact that it's deforested, despite the fact it's hard. The reason they live in the highlands and they don't live in the lowlands, tsetse fly and malaria. This highland area is a malaria-free area. So anyone who tells you you're going to highland areas of Ethiopia and tells you you should be taking malaria prophylactics, don't listen to them. You're more likely to cause yourself damage by the prophylactics than you are malaria, because there ain't no malaria there. What's important to realize is how hilly this country is. It is enormously hilly. This is what you find typical villages in highland areas. These are the houses, these are the fields. Really steep sloping fields. The population is so dense they're now onto fields 25-30% slopes. Another view of it here. For those women in the audience, if you are a woman in Ethiopia, you'll be living on the top of the hill, and that's where you get your water every day. It's about 2,000 foot climb. You'll carry 25-gallon drum 2-3 times a day, and you'll start doing it at about 8. The men, of course, are far too important to do that duty. Just again, giving you a picture of just how steep those slopes are that these people are living on, and that's how stony the soil is. You're talking about a population that's living right on the margins, trying. Typical villages, the Boma, this is surrounded by things. These in here, can we lose some of these lights, Mark, at the front, please? These are grain stores. They store the grains in there, mud and wattle formed. So these are really people who live on the margins. You want to go to these areas and you want to try and get some idea of their living standards. A good question to ask them is, how many times a year do they eat meat? How many times a year do you eat meat? Well, then let me ask you another question. How many times a day do you eat meat? 2, 3? They eat meat once a year. That's how poor they are in these areas. They eat meat at Fasika, what you would know as Easter. The potential in this area for high water supply and irrigation is enormous. This is a dam being built up in the area near the lake where the Blue Dam starts. You can see here, this is a dam. It's a roller compressed one. These are like 30, 40 ton trucks on here. Building this dam across. It's going to provide irrigation water. It's not going to provide anything in the way of hydropower. And if you might know, you never take water out at the bottom of a dam because of silting. You take it out from a tower further in. This dam has a 30-year life expectancy, giving you some sort of scale of how deep they expect the water to be here. They'll initially take the water in here. By the 10th to 15th year, they'll be taking the water in here because this dam will be silting up. There is enormous off-flow of topsoil in these areas because of the slopes on which people are farming, and because of the soil types, and because the rain falls in a highly concentrated period. So you get a lot of erosion coming off soil. Just to give you an idea, this is what they call a relatively small project. There's 3 of these outlets. This guy's 6.5 foot tall. So that's where they're going to be taking the water out for irrigation schemes. What happens if they get these irrigation schemes wrong? This is looking down on what was a dam. This is all silted up. According to the locals we spoke to when we were there, it took 5 years for that dam to silt up. So we are talking about an extreme section of irrigation. You see these little animals down here? That's them there. They're tiny. But this is all silted up. This is now an extremely rich farming area. So with a number of these dam type projects, in actual fact the silting up forms a rich dam area, a rich growing area. There is quite a lot of irrigation going on in the Upper Nile area. This is a Koga project which is quite near. It's basically got a catchment area of 22,000. It's feeding about 7,000 hectares. It's all flood irrigation. These pictures were taken at the same time of the year. So it's all flood irrigation controlled by where we set it. So if I open this gate, it'll flood down that channel. If I open this gate, it'll flood down that channel. Gets out into the fields. That's the difference in those fields at that time of the year. Same time of the year as the Highland areas. These people are now able to crop multiple times in each year. And that's how they control it. They just move a bit of earth and change the direction of where the flow goes. Very simple, not an expensive system, but actually quite wasteful. Another example here, they want the water to flow off this channel, so they just block this one off. Then when they want it to flow down this channel, they'll block that one off. Very simple irrigation schemes, and a lot of those are starting to be built in those highland areas. Another one, you just build a weir across the river, it raises the flow, and then you can direct the water off down channels to fields. This girl, as far as we found out, was 8 years old. She has about a 2-mile journey, and she does this multiple times every day to collect water from a pump. So we are in a situation with enormous water. If you read the Egyptian press, the Egyptians are really concerned about this dam filling up and affecting their rights to the Nile waters. Those happen to be treaties that were drawn up by imperial powers without the Ethiopians having any say on it. Egypt takes about 65% of the Nile waters at the moment. There's 14 Nile water states. Sudan takes another 20-odd percent. There's about 10 or 12% left for the rest of the Nile water states. This is the Blue Nile, a low water in the year, just short of the Gerd Dam. Get some sort of idea of how high this river is going to flow in the flood. Slightly closer up picture now. You can see how these are the animals we saw in the previous picture. You can see how far this river is going to come up in flood. This is a dry, lowland area of Ethiopia. There's very little agriculture here. So when you read people telling you the Gerds about irrigation, that's not right. To use this for irrigation, they'll have to pump. They won't. They'll take the water further up in the river valley system, several thousand feet. Oops. Sorry, try to avoid breaking the microphone. Okay, so this is a schematic illustration of the Gerd Dam. Here's the dam. They've got to put another Cotter Dam in at the side here to stop it, but then they're going to form this lake here. It is massive, literally. They're clearing most of the families out. There's the dam across here. At its peak, it's approximately 200 yards tall. That's looking down directly on where they're building the dam. Now, how they build this dam, they can't build it in the way the Grand Coulee was built, so they're not going to get people falling into the wet concrete and becoming part of the dam. This has to be formed with roller compressed concrete. Basically, they stick the concrete and roll it out, and it's a continuous 24-hour, 24/7 process. It's sort of a moist concrete that's compressed on. What they did is they channeled the river. They've got to get these sites high enough in one season so that there's enough capacity here to take the river in spate. They can't do what you do in these wet dams, drill a hole through the rock, divert the river off. Can't build a big enough hole. The range of flow on this, on the Blue Nile, is so great that they've got to take it through the center. Once they start filling this center, they've got a few channels where they can take some water through to release some pressure. But essentially, they'll start when the river drops, and as soon as they can get enough water going through the side, they'll cover these across here, and they've got to fill this block within a season. Because there's no way they can divert the Nile, the Blue Nile, around this dam in high spate. Okay. Give you some sort of idea of the scale of that dam. This is a zoomed in picture. That's a human being. These are massive, concrete trucks going 24/7. That's some sort of scale of this. It's an enormous building project going on there. And these are the residual villages that are flushed out. It's a very sparsely populated area, so yeah, dams might not be a great idea, but this is a country that has water, needs to use it for irrigation, needs to use it for electricity generation, much as the Egyptians got caught threatening to bomb them. Give you some sort of idea of how radical the changes are on water management schemes in Ethiopia at the moment. These are, down here, are the schemes that have been commissioned. In total commissioned since 1953. Nearly all of these are on the Awash River or rivers flowing south and east. The two Finca projects here on the Blue Nile are actually minor generation. They were primarily built for irrigation purposes. But they're talking about 2,000 megawatt. The planned installation over the next 20 odd years is in the order of 15.5, 16 megawatts. So we're talking about massive expansion. Of that, the Gerd is going to account for 6,000 alone. I understand some of you went to Ethiopia and you went to Omo area, is that right? The Omo River ones, I think, like the Ibrigila series, yeah, they're big systems. They're big generation systems compared to many of you see in the world. Certainly a lot bigger than nearly anything in the Tennessee Valley Authority. But compared to the Gerd, they're tiny. Okay, some sort of context for you. One question that exists in here is, why is the World Bank and international organizations refuse to help fund this dam? The problem is that Ethiopia hasn't been able to get agreements to export electricity. Not too surprising. They've got some agreements for electricity exports that will come off the hydro capacity south and east of the Rift Valley, some to Djibouti for ports, some to Kenya, some to other countries. But essentially, that lies north and west of the Rift Valley, the logical markets for them to go to are Sudan and Egypt. The further you take electricity away, the more you get losses through transmission losses. And they're quite big distances we're talking about. What we said about trying to do in this research was assess what Ethiopia would need to achieve in order for the GERD to be a profitable exercise and a beneficial exercise. And to do this, we've constructed what's known as a global computable general equilibrium model. Essentially, it has a load of commodities and sectors covering each country, and it deals with all the trade between countries and the costs of production, etc. Most of you, I understand, are doing economics, microeconomics, yeah? You come across general equilibrium yet? Yeah, when you do, you're going to think, my God, my lecturer has finally become a complete sadist. Yeah, this is the one that students hate, right? But it's fun if you get your hang on it. And it's one of the only ways we can carry out the type of what-if analysis. What if Ethiopia does this? What if they do that? In a way that takes account of all production, all consumption, what the implications for households are, what the implications for income distribution and poverty might be. Okay, nearly all these ones on a global scale use something called the Global Trade Analysis Project databases. We've used one for 2007 because it's a right appropriate start. We kept a number of commodities in here, primarily to represent consumption commodities. We also kept a number of electricity commodities: oil, gas, coal, petroleum, electricity, and gas. And we kept a number of regions in here: Egypt, Ethiopia, rest of Eastern Africa, the Congo, Angola, Kenya, trying to keep these African states that were relevant in detail, and then aggregating the rest of the world: USA, China, the major players. And it covers the whole world, so everything else that wasn't in one of these regions is lumped into a rest of the world account. Okay? What we've done is we've taken this database and we've replaced the data within country with detailed data for Egypt, Ethiopia, Kenya, and the rest of East Africa. The reason is this database doesn't have enough detail on those particular countries for what we want to analyze, so we can get a handle on it. And the other thing we've had to do that this database doesn't do is it doesn't distinguish between different ways of generating electricity. It just has electricity generation, whether it's by hydro or what. So we've included data to segment the electricity generation into a sector that generates electricity using hydropower, which has one cost structure, and other means of generating which has another one, which for instance uses a lot of fossil fuel. Yeah? Okay. So, we're using a version of the model called Globe Energy. It's actually a model that Karen Thierfelder and myself developed over a number of years, and we've used the dynamic version of it. In other words, we're going to be looking over what happens to this project over a 30-year period. So we're going to be looking forward because this project will take time to unfold, and it's not the immediate, what happens now that matters to us, the comparative static. It's what happens into the future that matters to us. We use some ways for modeling trade, which are typical to this literature, and we make some assumptions for final demand. Big one we use is Stone-Geary utility function. I got taught about Stone-Geary utility function when I was an undergraduate. I had no idea what the guy teaching me was talking about, and he never explained why he was teaching me it. Here's the simple reason. We use a Stone-Geary. It's very like a Cobb-Douglas. You've all come across Cobb-Douglas? Yeah. You know, I know. Certainly one of my supervisors, after he got his PhD, offered his Cobb-Douglas production for sale for someone who wanted to complete a PhD. Basically, it's a Cobb-Douglas production function with the axes shifted. And the reason we want to use it and we want to shift those axes is that we don't want people consuming too little food. So if I've got food on one axis, non-food on the other, I put a limit on how little food they can consume. So in a developing country, this is really important because I need to allow for subsistence consumption. Yeah? Papa John's not considered subsistence. You know, tell me when you've not eaten for 4 or 5 days, and then I might start thinking about calling it subsistence, right? Okay, so that's why we're going to use this, and it's really quite important to set this thing up when you're modeling developing countries or poor countries where you keep the subsistence consumption in. Otherwise, we'll get people surviving on eating electricity, which doesn't really make a lot of sense. Okay, we got a complex production system in here. These are what called nested functions. And this looks very pretty and it looks very confusing. It isn't really. All it's saying is that we allow certain things to substitute for each other, right? Right, down here, what I've got to do is I've got to add together, let's choose one that we can add together. Electricity. So I'm going to add together 2 inputs, apples and oranges, to give me a third, right? So I'm going to add together coal, oil, and gas so as to give me aggregate fossil fuels, yeah? And it's a classic thing that economists do. We're just aggregating, and we're saying that I don't think I can substitute electricity as easily as I can for coal, as easily as I can substitute gas for coal, yeah? So what I'm doing is I'm allowing the substitution possibilities between different inputs to be different, yeah? So it's easy for me to substitute oil for coal, but difficult for me to substitute people for coal, yeah? So this just allows some flexibility to give us a more realistic picture of what's going on. Okay, with the dynamics, and this is, I'll do this very briefly, the situation with the dynamics, and when you run these dynamic models, is we want to compare the outcome with the business as usual. What we're going to do is we're going to take this model and we're going to shock it by putting this dam in and building this dam, yeah, and generating electricity. What we do first is we generate a scenario that says, what if we don't build the dam? How's this economy going to develop over the next 30 years? So we create a baseline, a business as usual baseline. Then we go back and restart the model and say, now, working with that, we're going to see what happens if we do put the dam in. And then we're going to compare the results with the dam with the business as usual. Yeah? Okay, so it's a what-if type analysis. Do we need anything? Oh, yeah. Okay. Right. How many of you have done first-year maths for economics? Most of you, yeah? And they taught you all about second-order conditions? Second derivatives and everything, the sign on the second derivative? You all look totally enthralled by this, by the way. Yeah? Yeah, you remember that? The next time your lecturer tells you that using a Cobb-Douglas function and they're going to do a second-order condition, just have a little bit doubt whether they've got good enough maths. Because the functions we choose don't need any second-order conditions. Second-order condition is what happens if this function loops around here. I want to know whether it's a minimum or a maximum, yeah? Cobb-Douglas never loops back. None of the functions we use loop back as standard functions, yeah? A little bit of a problem if you use the translog, but we can get around that. But there's a problem with them for this type of analysis and for any type of economic analysis. If I've not been consuming a commodity or using it as an input in the base period, I will never use it. Right? So if Ethiopia's not been exporting electricity, and I work with standard economic models, Ethiopia will never export electricity. Right? And in the same way, these functions can never go to zero. There's a non-zero property. So however much the price of C2 goes up, I will never stop consuming C2. Right? So here's a problem. Ethiopia doesn't export electricity. Why doesn't Ethiopia export electricity? Because Ethiopia doesn't even have enough electricity at the moment for its own needs. But if it's going to build all these dams, it's going to have to export electricity to pay for them. And it's not a bad idea. Ethiopia is saying now, rather than the Egyptians having sole use of the Nile waters, we're going to have some use of it. It's the only real natural resource we have. We might as well cash in on it. But if I set this up as a conventional model, what's going to happen is it's going to say Ethiopia is never going to invest in the GERD because it's never going to be able to export. So we need to trick the model. We need to trick the model so that we cause Ethiopia to start exporting, right? It's a trick, but it's one that's studying economics you need to try and understand, because otherwise you run the risk of not understanding why people do things and what the limitations of these functions are that we use. The other thing about these functions that matters is shares matter. These functions really work well in the middle here. If I get up towards the edges here, they don't work very well. So some of the things we've been doing on here are to try and deal with this problem of how these functions operate. Initially, even when we trick this function, Ethiopia is going to be really close to this axis. It's going to export very little. So we've got to keep the trick in there for a little while till we get the function into an area in which it works sensibly. Okay, what are the scenarios we looked at? We looked at 5 scenarios that we're going to report. These ones here. Okay, so this is if I build the dam. Now, to do this, I've got to fund this domestically. And the government's going to fund it. So the government's got to raise $9 billion a year for 5 years to fund that dam building, right? The only way it's going to be able to do that domestically is tax the population, right? So it's going to take tax off them. To build the dam, it's going to have to use public funds to build that dam. So there's going to have to be public fund investment in building the dam. And the capital it's going to create with that public investment isn't going to get used for 5 years, because it's going to take them 5 years to build the dam. So for 5 years, this economy is going to be dragging money out of the population. It's going to be building a dam that's not going to make any return for them. That's why we need to look at the time horizon. Okay, we now get on to what happens if we keep that bit, but we get the position that Ethiopia can start exporting electricity to Egypt, Sudan, and Kenya. Okay? Then we get into the situation here where it can export it, and those Nile countries that it can export to are growing more rapidly than we had expected to in the baseline. Okay? Remember, this is all what-if analysis. We're not going to say that those countries are growing more. We're saying what happens if they do grow more. Yeah? We then get into the situation saying, what happens if we can increase domestic electricity consumption? Ethiopia's been short of electricity, therefore most of its production processes use very little electricity. It's not a reliable source of power for manufacturing. So we're also going to have to trick the manufacturers so that they start using more electricity to get the thing moving. The other thing they want to do is they want to get rural electrification processes. What happens if rural households can get electricity? Not necessarily a bad idea. There's a good chance they'll start chopping less trees down. And the Ethiopians don't chop trees down because they're stupid. They chop the trees down because if they don't chop the trees down, they don't have any wood, they don't have any fuel, so they don't eat today. They know full well it's increasing the runoff and erosion they're suffering. They don't have a choice. We get some rural electrification in, we're likely to be able to ease back on the amount of environmental degradation that's going on in these areas. And then finally, this one here, we stick them all together to see what happens if everything happens. Okay? So, what happens to GDP? This is percentage deviations from the baseline. So here's my dam scenario. I build the dam, and I've now got all this extra electricity coming into the economy. Yeah, it gives me a hit. I get some benefit from it. If I can export it, I'm going to get some extra benefit. Here's my extra benefit, this area here. If, on the other hand, the other countries that I'm exporting to grow better, this green one, boy, do I do better. So their performance really matters to Ethiopia. They've got to be able to export it, but if the other countries do well, that's... But the big hits are coming if, what if I can get electrification working at home? What if I can reduce the costs of domestic production? What if I can make the Ethiopian economy more competitive? Yeah? And then if I stick them all together, I get double bubble. I get a bit extra. We've not put in the growth and electricity and exporting, but that's going to take us way up here. Yeah? Turns out when we start adding this together, this is not enough. If they can't export the electricity, this dam is going to be a problem. It's going to leave Ethiopia with serious debt, and Ethiopia is going to be even more reliant on the Ethiopian diaspora to keep their economy stable. Okay, terms of trade. I know a chunk of you are doing trade course. I've also been warned that I'm going to use a phrase here that probably makes absolutely no sense at all to you. Terms of trade are what happens to the relative price of imports to exports, simply put. What's going to happen here is you're going to get a deterioration of the terms of trade, an appreciation of the economy, the exchange rate, effectively going to drive this. Why is this happening? This is something called Dutch disease. It's called Dutch disease because it was first understood with respect to the Nijmegen gas discoveries in Holland. It basically says that what an economy gets is it gets a gift. It suddenly finds it's got a whole chunk of a natural resource that it didn't know it had before. Yeah? What that does is it means they can export those goods, their exchange rate will appreciate. Its obverse side is it damages the other industries in the economy because they become less competitive, because imports become relatively cheaper to the domestic goods. Where's the big case in recent years of Dutch disease? Australia. Australia has been exporting natural resources mass time to China, coal, etc. Earlier case was Botswana. Diamonds. Yeah? Produces approximately 75% of the world's gem quality diamonds. It's a country the size of France with a population of 1.75 million. Yeah? Okay, we see what happens with imports. They decline in the earlier period under most of the scenarios. Why do they decline? Because the government's dragging expenditure out of the households. It's having to tax the households to fund the project. Households have less money to spend, so in a sense you're getting a bit of shrinkage of the economy, which we saw in the GDP ones at the beginning, so that we can fund the project. However, once the project starts to take off, we start to see imports. And look what's happening here. You know, if I can export, I can really get a lot more imports coming in. I've suddenly got access to a lot more foreign exchange, and that's what we see when we see the exports. Exports have to increase in the early period. They have to increase to try and pay for the mine. Then they're dropping off as the rest of the economy starts to pick up. And I'm just going to make it on time. Okay. This is where the nightmare scenario comes in for the government. This is what would happen to the consumer price of electricity, business as usual. Okay, if we don't do the GERD. If we do the GERD and we just get the dam, electricity price crashes to about 45% of what it was. That's the only way that the economy can absorb the extra electricity. The price has just got to drop enough so that the demand can go up enough. Okay, after a while it's going to start picking up as the economy starts growing its natural route. It comes off. If I can get to export some stuff, yeah, it's going to reduce the fall in the price of the consumer price. The consumer price fall is potentially really good news because this is the price that industry is going to have to pay for electricity, for energy. So the price of electricity in Ethiopia is going to fall sharply. Ethiopia will then not need to import as much fossil fuel. It has no natural fossil fuel sources. All its oil and coal and everything has to come in through imports. So it will reduce the cost of production in the economy. Ethiopian economy will become more productive, more competitive, assuming the developed world allow them to export, which is something we've not been doing. What we see, and this is household consumption. This is the thing we're ultimately interested in. Yeah? You remember consumer sovereignty? That sort of strange idea that your lecturers occasionally tell you about, and then you find no reason to understand where that came from in the lecture and how it relates to what they're teaching you now. What we're interested in is people. Yeah? No, it's hard to believe that your economics professors are people. I know that. I thought that when I was a student. Now a professor, I kind of think that students aren't people. But never mind, this is how these things develop. But we've got to squeeze it out of people at the beginning. I've got to squeeze household consumption at the beginning because I've got to fund this dam. I can't borrow the money because the World Bank won't let me have it. So the only way I'm going to be able to fund this dam is by squeezing household consumption at the beginning. The payoff, if everything works, is once the electricity starts flowing. And the more I can export, the more I can get the electricity generation, the pickup of electricity domestically going, the bigger the payoff. Here's the critical point. Am I ever going to get the payoff? Am I ever going to be able to export? The critical requirement is somebody's going to have to want to import this electricity from Ethiopia. Life is real, I'm not allowed to say this, but it bites, if you know the saying. Life is a da-da-da, but it bites, right? The Egyptians have just made massive gas discoveries. And the Egyptians are really rather annoyed with the Ethiopians for building this dam to the extent that someone foolishly left a camera running during a Morsi cabinet meeting where they debated bombing the dam. Right? Ethiopia's got to export this. If it doesn't export this, it's not going to get the benefits back to the human beings. It's not going to be a viable economic proposition. That's the nightmare scenario for Ethiopia. So getting those exports matters. If it doesn't get those exports, the only way it's going to have out of this is to accelerate the domestic use of electricity. The problem with it doing that is it requires electrification schemes, and that requires more investment. And there's a limit to how long you can keep investing without getting a return. It does raise classic Dutch disease issues. Now, we keep hearing Dutch disease. It sounds, like a nasty social disease that we don't want to get, right? Sorry, someone comes to you and says, here's $1 million. Is that a disease? Now, what's the problem with Dutch disease is what you do with it. If you're an intelligent economy, and I would suggest the Australians aren't, but the Botswana are, you run a government budget surplus and you run a current account surplus. You export capital. You don't consume it now. So what you do is you buy assets overseas so that when your asset runs out, you can cash back the assets. You don't allow it to go into current consumption. So Dutch disease is only a problem if the government doesn't know what it's doing. But it does put a big burden on the government's understanding. The unfortunate thing, if you're Botswana and you decide to invest a hell of a lot in education, and then HIV arrives and kills off your population big time. Botswana, just before the HIV epidemic hit, had succeeded in increasing life expectancy at birth from independence to then from in the low 40s to 67. Within 3 years, life expectancy at birth had fallen back to less than at independence. Irrigation. Irrigation's going to be a big issue. The Egyptians are annoyed about GERD. They missed the entire thing. Ethiopia doesn't need the water down where GERD is. It needs it up in the rivers that will feed into GERD. That's where the people are, that's where the irrigation potential is. No one wants to go down, live where GERD is too much. There's mosquitoes, there's tsetse fly. It's not a pleasant place to be. So, the GERD locale, it's not really likely that that's going to be a source of irrigation expenditure. Most likely we're going to see it upstream, particularly in the Abe and the Boro Akbo catchment areas, and particularly in the Abe catchment areas, where there's an enormous population and an enormous demand for irrigation. You know, if we can get to be cropping 2-3 times a year, which is potential on land with water, that's going to allow people to come back off the hills if they can control population growth. But I haven't worked out a CGE model that can sort out how to control population growth yet. If you come up with one, I'm sure there's a Nobel Prize in it for you. Thank you for your attention.
We have time for a couple of questions. Turn this thing, get this out of our eyes. We're close to. Well, let's thank Dr. McDonald for his time and his visit to the Naval Academy.